There's a number. Trump's economic advisors have been putting on the first line of every Hormuz briefing since traffic stopped in March 2026. 20%. It's not a guess, it's not a projection. From an econometric model, you can argue away with somebody else's econometric model. It's the documented, verified share of all the oil and liquefied natural gas that moves through the strait under normal ops. About 21 million barrels a day through a shipping lane 33 kilometers across at its narrowest, with Iran on one flank and Oman on the other. When that traffic stops, the shock doesn't stay in the Middle East. It rips through the global price chain at futures market speed, which in plain English means oil prices everywhere on the planet start climbing before the last commercial ships even finished slowing down. Since March 4th, 2026, the traffic's been stopped. And how you reopen it, or whether you try to force it open at all, may be the longest tail call any American president's faced since George W. Bush signed the authorization for military force against Iraq in October 2002. Not because Iran stacks up to the United States militarily, not because there's any real doubt who wins an outright conventional war between the two, but because the stakes aren't only military, and winning the war isn't the same thing as winning whatever comes after the war. A lesson the US government learned in Iraq at a price the generation that paid it still hasn't fully digested. To see why this specific mission could define the Trump presidency in a way no other second-term call has yet, you have to look at what's playing out on both sides of the argument, without the filter of people who need the president to look tough, and without the filter of people who need him to look reckless. Both lenses warp what's actually on the table. The case for fast, decisive military action gets laid out inside the National Security Council in logic that deserves to be heard on its own terms, not the automatic markdown critical coverage so often slaps on it. The argument starts with precedent, with Iran closed one of the global economy's most critical arteries as a negotiating lever, an action that, if it isn't met with enough force to make the price to the regime irreversible, sets a precedent that goes way past this conflict. If choking the Strait of Hormuz is a tool any regional regime can use without paying a definitive cost, then the threat of closure becomes permanent, a coercion instrument that outlives any specific deal and gets pulled out in the next crisis, and the one after that. Long-term stability of global energy supply on the interventionist red depends on killing that threat now, while US forces are already in theater, while Iranian response capacities partly degraded by the February strikes, and while the military windows open in a way that can slam shut fast if Iran rebuilds its defenses. The second piece is what national security aides call the cost of inaction. Every week the strait stays closed is a week America's Gulf allies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, quietly reassess whether Washington's got both the will and the capacity to protect interests it said for decades it would protect. Alliances are implicit contracts that don't hold in a crisis don't survive the crisis. An America that didn't reopen Hormuz when it had 17,000 troops in the region and 2 carrier strike groups in the Arabian Gulf is an America Gulf states will recalibrate as a strategic partner. And whatever room Washington leaves gets filled by Beijing, which for years has been offering economic infrastructure without the political fine print that comes with the American relationship. The third piece, and the hardest to say out loud without sounding like you're folding politics into national security, is the domestic window argument. The US midterms are November 2026. A conflict that doesn't resolve in months, that settles into permanent squeeze with no story you can sell as a win, isn't just a military headache. It's the kind of narrative that historically eats away at any administration's political base in a long crisis. Political hands inside the White House get that as clearly as any outside analyst, even if none of them say it in NSC meetings, where that kind of consideration's technically off-limits for driving military decisions. Now the other side, which also has arguments that deserve their own hearing, the case against a large-scale ground op on Iranian islands starts with geography that doesn't stack up for the attacker. The islands the Pentagon's eyeing, Karg, Larak, Abu Musa, have physical profiles that are a sustained occupation nightmare. Karg sits 25 kilometers off the Iranian coast, within range of pretty much anything the IRGC can put in play, from medium-range tube artillery to precision cruise missiles. A US force that takes Karg and has to hold it under constant shorefire isn't sitting on a win, it's parked on a bleed the Iranians can sustain indefinitely on the cheap, throwing relatively inexpensive systems at an occupying force that, to defend itself properly, needs pricey logistics, round-the-clock air cover, and personnel rotations that pull on American capacity everywhere else. In March 2026, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft published an analysis that nails the point. Limited ground operations in Iran won't shift the strategic balance, because the strategic balance isn't decided by islands, it's decided by regimes, and a regime that survived 40 years of US pressure, that's built domestic legitimacy around the story of standing up to American imperialism, doesn't implode because it lost an island in the Gulf. It may actually come out stronger at home than it went in. The second piece of the counter case is historical, and it's tough to argue honestly. The United States has done this before, not in Iran specifically, but the pattern's familiar. In 2003, the Intel case that sold the Iraq invasion projected weeks of fighting, a welcoming population, a fairly quick glide path to stability. The war ran 8 years in its official phase, and we're still living with the tail. In 2001, Afghanistan was framed as a capacity-smashing operation that turned into the longest war in American history. The question veterans with command time in those theaters raise isn't whether the US can take Karg. Obviously it can. It's what happens the next day, and the next month, and the 18 months before the midterms if the situation doesn't break the way the optimistic briefs said it would. The third piece is economic, laid out by economist Paul Krugman in a Fortune column in April 2026, and by analysts at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, with a clarity national security coverage often doesn't hit. Trump has said publicly the US imports almost no oil through Hormuz, and that stabilizing the strait, while important for allies, isn't a direct American economic survival issue. The claim is technically defensible in the narrowest sense. The US is the world's top oil producer, and the share of consumption that transits Hormuz is far smaller than it was in 2008, when the last big energy price shock stress-tested the US economy in a comparable way. But oil's priced in a global market. When 20% of world supply vanishes overnight, no matter where any specific barrel's headed or where it came from, the price spikes for everyone because oil's fungible, and futures price global scarcity, not local scarcity. The American filling up at a pump in Iowa is paying the tab for a straight 12,000 kilometers away, not because the gas in their tank came from the Gulf, because the price of that gas is set by the same global market that just lost a fifth of supply. Brent touched $120 a barrel. Al Jazeera documented in March 2026 that every US statement hinting the conflict was dragging on with no end in sight was followed by another leg up in energy markets. Markets price uncertainty every bit as ruthlessly as real shortage. There's a third lane that rarely makes American cable, but that foreign policy hands in both parties bring up in conversations that aren't for attribution. It's not the case for fast intervention, and it's not the case against. It's the read that Iran didn't close the strait to say it won't negotiate, but as the most aggressive possible opener to a negotiation, the regime felt it had to force, under conditions it saw as more favorable than business as usual. When you spell the logic out, it holds. A regime that chokes the Strait knowing it'll eat a brutal domestic economic cost. Iran depends on the Strait for imports too, including food and industrial inputs, is signaling it's willing to pay that price to drag the other side to the table. That's the move of an actor angling for a negotiated off-ramp on specific terms, not an actor looking to get wiped off the map. And actors who want a deal can be reached if diplomacies run with enough sophistication for both sides to save enough face to sell the agreement at home. The Middle East Institute noted Iran's initial rejection of the American proposal for a naval escort through the Strait came couched in language that left room for conditional reconsideration, which, in regional diplomatic grammar, is often the first sentence of a negotiation. Not the last word. Trump's political history and his dealmaker temperament give him a relationship with agreements that's fundamentally different from his predecessors. He walked from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, in 2018 because he saw it as structurally flawed. He's also the president who publicly owned the Abraham Accords and who, in his first term, took the Iran confrontation to the edge with the Soleimani strike, then stepped back when Iran responded with calculated strikes aimed not to kill Americans, a sequence both sides read as deliberate de-escalation dressed up as retaliation. The question the most seasoned White House hands are asking behind closed doors isn't only about Hormuz, it's about legacy. Lyndon Johnson was consumed by Vietnam, George W. Bush was defined by Iraq, Barack Obama was defined by the withdrawal he inherited and the restraint he chose. Trump, first time around, was shaped by wars he didn't start, and a foreign policy that promised an end to endless war, a promise the electorate that brought him back in 2024 remembered and expected to see honored. A second term that ends with US forces on Iranian islands with no clean finish, oil above $100 a barrel, and midterms forcing every Republican candidate to defend or attack a war none of them voted to start. That's not the legacy the National Security Council's trying to build, but a second term that ends with Hormuz reopened, a deal that verifiably dismantles Iran's nuclear program, and American power projection in the Gulf demonstrated beyond doubt. That is, the gap between those two futures sits in one decision, made in one specific office in Washington, by one specific person. After briefings, most people reading the headlines will never see Delta Force is ready, the plans exist, the gear's in place. The question was never purely military. The next few weeks will show whether the answer is, if you want to grasp what Iran's doing militarily to make any American operation as expensive as possible, and how that buildup is shifting Delta Force's planning in real time before any order drops. This video's on screen now. Subscribe if you want to stay inside the analysis that separates what politicians say at the podium from what military planners are actually running the numbers on a few floors down.